Let's look at Georgia. It seems
Mm,
like since last week we talked, it's just one place after another. Just
yeah,
Georgia. Uh, it's very clear what is happening is the Maidan coup Georgia
yeah,
edition or
yeah, yeah.
Tbilisi Georgia edition. Is that what it is?
That is exactly what it is. It is nothing else. I mean, there was an election in Georgia. One side lost badly, another
Mhm.
side won big. So the
Mhm.
side that's lost badly is supported by the West, refuses to recognize the outcome of the elections. They have, through some odd means, a president who is on their side against the government, and they're trying to overthrow the government. That's basically what they're doing. I mean, they will accept the illegitimacy of any election provided they are the ones who win it. Every other election, one which they lose, is by definition illegitimate, and that's what we're seeing in Georgia today. And of course, they are fanatically aligned with the West. And unsurprisingly, the West supports them and doesn't just support them. The West is encouraging them and instigating and organizing them and is threatening the Georgian government in order to try to help these people gain power.
West have got into a habit now that they just
Yeah.
don't recognize election results now. I mean, they don't recognize Venezuela's election.
No,
I don't think they fully endorse the election in Russia. Uh,
no.
I think they have to deal with Putin because Russia is Russia, right? But for smaller countries, they could just downright doesn't recognize the election result, like in Georgia's case in Venezuela, right? And I think at least in the past that they at least pretend that they don't make it so obvious, and now they seems like
Yeah.
they don't care anymore. If you elect somebody I don't like, I just don't recognize your result.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They have established themselves as the real electorate. The
Yeah.
country of the country, the people of the country are not the electorate. The Western powers are. It's they who decide who wins the elections, not the people.
Yeah.
It's a new definition of democracy, a very interesting one.
Um, Ukraine, I don't know if you see this article.
Mm,
TASS had an article a few days ago. The
mm,
title of that, I think it says Romania, Poland, Germany, UK plan to divide
mm.
Ukraine. This is
Yeah,
according to Russian foreign intel.
yeah.
So, like what the title says is so according to Russian,
Mm,
the NATO's plan now is possibly sending in the peacekeeping troops, about
mm,
100,000, and they're
mm,
going to divide them into different parts of Ukraine in the name of protecting Ukraine, but
mm.
essentially dividing Ukraine. Now, what's your view on that? What's the possibility? Is
Well,
that a real possibility, first of all?
yes, it is. I think it is absolutely a possibility, and I think it's very much under discussion. And of course, 100,000 men is not a peacekeeping force; it is a war-fighting force. I mean, you don't send 100,000 men to keep peace; you send 100,000 men to wage war. That's I would have thought that was obvious, actually. So the plan. And I think this is a plan that's been hatched independently of Donald Trump, is get a
Uh-huh.
ceasefire, bring Ukraine into NATO as quickly as you can, send this NATO army in, pretend that it's not a NATO army, call it a peacekeeping force, then wait a little time, say that the Russians have violated the ceasefire in some way, resume the war, and then the Russians are fighting the Western powers, this 100,000 man army. And of course, NATO membership will extend to the entirety of Ukraine because
Mhm.
Zelensky is insisting on it. And then, as a result of that war, you'll be able to drive the Russians. The West will drive the Russians out of the whole of Ukraine for Ukraine. That, I think, is what the Ukrainians want. And I think it is what some of the more extreme elements in the West want. And this is what this plan is about. I think Starmer wants it. I think perhaps Macron wants it. Certainly the Ukrainians want it. The NATO secretariat want it, Mark Rutte and people of that kind. Of course, the Russians will never agree.
No, this is a horrible plan.
That's a terrible plan. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's I mean, it's an attempt to win the war that is being lost on the battlefield.
Yeah.
It's to use a trick in order, a diplomatic trick in order to win the war. But that is basically what it is.
What the Now that there's a lot of discussion about this plan in the Chinese media, what the Chinese
Yeah.
media was saying is that when you do that, you put in different forces, armed forces, militaries into different parts of the country. You essentially divided this country.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if those military personnel stay there long enough, you basically occupy a country.
Absolutely.
And
I mean that is the ultimate objective. I mean, bear in mind that the Ukraine war is not ultimately about Ukraine. It is
no,
about
yeah,
controlling Ukraine and ultimately destabilizing Russia. And controlling Ukraine, it's now become increasingly straightforwardly admitted by Lindsey Graham in the United States, by important political figures in Germany, that it's about controlling Ukraine's resources. It's lithium, which is in eastern Ukraine, it's grain. I mean, Starmer talked about, he gave a speech to at the Mansion House, the Lord Mayor's speech. It's an important speech that the Prime Minister gives every year, in which he spoke, I thought, very interestingly about Ukraine's natural resources again. So you can see what this is all about. It's about continuing the extraction of wealth from Ukraine in order to keep the European, especially the European economies going.
yeah. And then some Chinese analysts even saying that if this plan become a reality, there is a possibility 20, 30 years down the road, Ukraine as a country will stop to exist. It will
Yes,
become divided into parts of other countries,
yes.
right?
Well, bear in mind that if you're talking about Romania,
Hmm.
Poland, Poland and Romania have previously occupied significant territories of what is
Yeah,
now Ukraine.
yeah,
So, of
yeah.
course, Poland historically has had a claim
Hmm.
to the territory that is known as Western Ukraine. Not many people know this, but Romania has previously made claims to and occupied large areas along Ukraine's Black Sea coast, including the city of Odessa.
Hmm.
During the Second World War, Odessa was actually transferred by the Germans to Romania. Romania, in theory, controlled Odessa. So, absolutely, I mean, that is exactly where all this would lead to. You would see the partition and breakup of Ukraine and its absorption into spheres, firstly of influence, and then probably outright annexation by the Western powers. And of course, the Ukrainian population, in the meantime, reducing literally every month as more people die in the war, as more people leave.
Actually, the more I read about these things, because I knew very little about Ukraine in the past until this war started. And so the more I read about it, the more I think actually for Ukraine as a country, the best option is actually to be with Russia. Because Russia is the one country that has a general interest to protect Ukraine. I don't think any other country has the interest to protect Ukraine. They all want part of Ukraine, isn't it?
This is absolutely true. I mean, Ukraine prospered, the Ukrainian people prospered. And prosperity is not the wrong word, by the way. I mean, it was one of the most economically advanced areas of the Soviet Union. They've always prospered as part of Russia. Whenever they've set themselves in opposition to Russia, it's always been a disaster to them. The only period in post independence Ukraine where the Ukrainian economy has experienced sustained and successful growth was in a brief period before the Orange Revolution in
Mhm.
2004, when Ukraine, the then independent Ukrainian government of Kuchma and Yanukovych, had aligned themselves very closely to Russia, and where there was talk that they would actually join with the Russians in forming a single economic community. At all other times, Ukraine has been going backwards.
And the other thing is actually lots of people don't understand is that before the war broke, China had a good relationship with
Yeah,
Ukraine. I
yeah,
would say probably during the Zelensky time is not as good, but before that, it was
yeah,
always very close, and they
yes,
were. they were buying, they were investing in Ukraine. And actually, so when the war started, China, some of China's investment, actually, they lost money because of the war.
Yeah, yeah,
China is always interested in doing business. I mean, that
yeah.
China is not interested in
Mm.
just taking things away from other country and disrespectful or being hegemony or a bully of any kind. And Ukraine at the time was Ukraine after post-Soviet was in need of investment, in need of doing trade and all that sort of thing. It's actually complemented pretty well with each other. So lots of people believe that China just immediately jumped into Russia's side. I don't think it's true. I think China is very, very troubled by the war, I think.
I
And
think
hard,
I think China has moved heaven and earth to bring the
yeah,
war to an end.
yeah,
I think that all attempts to argue otherwise are completely at variance with the facts. The Chinese have been consistently talking sense. They've repeatedly said, look, you've got to look at the genuine realities, the actual causes of the war. They've not provided weapons to the Russians. There's no evidence that they have ever done so. They
yeah,
maintain trade with Russia. They've tried to maintain trade with Ukraine. They've always given the Ukrainians good advice, which the Ukrainians have always rejected. They've treated the Ukrainians with great respect. I think China has never shown any sign of hostility to Ukraine at all. The party that consistently shows hostility to China with respect to Ukraine is the United States, which has used the war and its influence before the war in Ukraine to try to extinguish Chinese influence there. I'm sure that people in China remember this. I don't remember the exact details, but I remember that there was a major investment that China wanted to do
yeah.
in, I think it was the factory in Zaporozhye, the one that makes gas turbine engines and helicopter engines and all of those things. And the United States basically blocked it. So
Yeah,
there you go.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's certainly angered China a lot, so
Yeah,
yeah. And that was, I think, under Zelensky. That's,
yeah.
yeah. In terms of Lindsey Graham, yeah, you're totally right. Lindsey Graham recently has an interview with somebody from the Fox, and he said the Ukraine war is about money. It's about making money for the United
Mm,
States, and he said that. He
mm,
made it very
yeah,
clear. One thing
yeah,
about Lindsey Graham is that he actually is very straightforward. He's very
yeah,
honest.
yeah,
And the other
absolutely.
thing recently he said about ICC, this is what he said. What I find is absolutely fascinating. He said, Rome Statute does not apply to Israel or United States or France or Germany or Great Britain because it wasn't conceived to come after us. He said that. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
He
designed
did.
to
He did.
come after the people or the country we don't like, not us.
Yeah. Absolutely. I come back to the points we've made in many of our programs. And I think this is something that people in China do need to understand. Not everybody in the West, but if you like, still the ascendant political leaders in the West, the ones who have the most control, they have never given up their imperialist, colonialist
Mhm.
mentality. So, interest in Ukraine, it's all out.
Yeah.
Go where the resources are: the grain, the lithium, the manganese, all of the natural gas, all of those things. That's why Biden was there. He was
Yeah.
going there for the natural gas. So you go for all of that. You enrich yourself personally.
Mhm.
And of course, you keep your economies going. But you're not really there to conduct straightforward trade,
Yeah.
because straightforward trade, despite all the talk about free trade and all of that, is not what the West has ever done. They've never really been into free trade, never at any point in their history.
Yeah.